Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Respecting the Beer. My name is Gary Arndt. With me again, as usual, is Professor Allison McCoy, the proprietor of McFleshman's Brewing Company. And back on the show is the historian of hops and the chancellor of beer school, Mr. Joel Hermansen. How are you doing, sir?
That's a great
That was
title.
fabulous. I need a business card with that. Can we get a business card with that?
Noted.
Okay.
So when you were on in the past, we talked really kind of about the ancient origins of beer. And now we want to start talking about beer in the United States.
Yeah.
Because it has a unique history here, kind of had a different route or different history than it did in Europe, where it was, initially founded. So where does the story of beer in America start?
Can I back up for one quick second?
Sure.
I think I'm really, first of all, really happy to be here. But one of the things that makes this place unique, because I want to try to tie this to McFleshman's, when Bobby brews a beer, when there's a thought process that goes into brewing a beer, the history really is considered. And the beer tenders do try to develop a certain historic fluency, because the people that come here want to have beer conversations. And that's one of the reasons that I love doing these podcasts, because, people do come in and talk about some of the things that we talk about. But, the beer tenders here, we try to get Cicerone certification. We try to have some historical and tasting knowledge of the beer so that we talk about these things. So just kind of a little sidebar to, kind of the method behind this madness. We really do try to be historical. And I say that as we're sitting in this awesome, prohibition room, which commemorates the history of beer after 1933. So thank you. Thank you for indulging me.
I think that's important because, what separates a place like this from your run-of-the-mill bar or a beer that you can buy someplace else isn't just the quality of the beer, which is a very high quality, but that certain something extra, whether it's even, one of the things I notice is when you guys pour like a stout or something, like the quest for the perfect pour and getting the perfect head.
Oh, Nancy does that every time. She's amazing.
Or even, going so far as like take pictures of, your favorite. I mean,
Yep.
There's something to it that you're just not going to get in many other places.
Well, I think that there's the history part of it. We can become quite obsessed. I remember there was a beer fest last year that some folks came over to our booth and they were like, "What's the weirdest thing you have?" And I looked down and they, of course, want some sort of like ecto cooler green slushy IPA stout thing mixed with beatbox of some sort. And I looked down and I'm like, oh, weirdest thing? Oh, get this. And they're all excited. And I have an Oktoberfest, which is a Marzen lager in a cask. And I was like, look, it's cask conditioned Oktoberfest. And they look at me like, I don't understand. I was like, that is very strange because we respect its history so much.
You should just bring a packet of lime Kool-Aid with you to these events and then just dump it in and go there. That's weird enough for you?
I quit.
I don't think that would be respecting the beer.
I don't think it would either.
Yeah.
Anyways,
so back to
beer in
United
American
States.
history.
Yeah.
Right.
Where does the story of beer in America start?
So when we do our beer in U.S. history class, which usually runs at some point in the fall.
Yep.
Figure that date out. We always talk a little bit about pre-Columbian peoples, because I think we have sometimes a Eurocentric bias when we look at the history of the United States, and we don't take into account that there have been people living in this hemisphere for an incredibly long period of time. And much like the people in Europe, they stored grain. And the grain that they stored is different because wheat was not indigenous to this hemisphere. So they utilized different grains, predominantly corn. And when you store grain, particularly in a non-airtight vessel, it is going to saturate, it is going to sprout, it is going to ferment. And they realize that the same as European peoples did. and Eurasian peoples. So it really does start there. And, we have kind of a historical beer that's made by Dogfish Head that kind of accommodates that. That's the Peruvian chicha beer, which they actually grind with their own mouth. And
let me add some color to it. They chew it up and they spit out into a big bucket and then slosh that about, and then that becomes the mash. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I've never really fully got behind that.
You should totally do one.
Right. Right.
That's the face you made.
Right. You can't see the face on the podcast.
Oh, God.
You can get an idea. And then they would obviously spice it as best they could with, fruits and things and herbs. So they were on a similar trajectory that Eurasian people were. Because as we've talked about, and I come back to that quote that we always talk about on the podcast when I'm on from Professor George Bamforth about beer really being the basis of modern static civilization. As civilizations have grown and changed, beer technology has grown and changed, and it's driven science, it's driven social movements and cultural movements and political movements and things like that. So the people of ancient America really aren't any different.
Have you heard of anyone ever trying to make a corn-based beer? Or maybe not chewing it in their mouth, but trying to replicate these original drinks?
Replicate the original drinks? That I'm not sure. Aside from what Dogfish Head did, in which the chicha, you need the enzymes in the spit that helps move along.
That accelerates the
process.
Fermentation process.
But a Mexican lager is brewed with corn. Then you can get into the industrial lagers that supplemented barley with corn and rice. But yeah, I think corn is used a lot. At least our Mexican lager, we have that.
I don't think there's a beer that is made exclusively with corn as the grain. I'm sure that people living, in the Andes highlands maybe still do that. I don't, because wheat doesn't grow particularly well at higher altitudes. So they're probably still largely corn dependent. But I don't think there's a domestically produced beer that does that.
In Bobby's absence, I go to Google.
Yes.
Bobby's
like Google.
He is. He's the beer Google.
Yes.
That's amazing.
But then obviously when Europeans started to come into the hemisphere after the Columbian Exchange, the beer universe changed dramatically. As it did across the entire culinary universe. It's not just beer. Food changed, and all of a sudden barley is here, and hops make an appearance, and things like that, and they stop using some of the indigenous herbs and spruce tips and things like that, and beer starts to become more systematic.
So when the Europeans first started coming over, and I don't know the answer to this. Did the Spanish? You don't think of them as big brewers?
No.
Did they?
No, probably the first brewing footprint in this hemisphere is probably, from a European perspective, is probably what we're seeing at Roanoke in the 1580s. They were brewing. In fact, in the short, I think it was a 36 to 48 month period that they were there, they had to send back for beer several times because the people that came from Europe to the Americas were usually of a specific demographic group, and they oftentimes forgot to bring brewers. They forgot to bring carpenters. They didn't bring like the people that were required. A lot of these people were upper class who were coming over here to dig for gold, and they forgot they were going to need to farm and build homes and brew beer and things like that.
It must be rough to not recognize the importance of the trades. Wow.
Right. It's almost like we've come full circle.
I have to go back to my U.S. history from high school. Thank goodness you're sitting next to me. Roanoke, that was German folk or English folk?
English. Walter Raleigh, 1580s. That was the one that disappeared. And the only, it's a great mystery. The only thing they found was the word Croatoan carved into a tree. Otherwise, everyone vanished. And
I did an episode on that on my podcast. And
you did, yeah.
The theory is kind of that they probably were suffering a famine, and they went to live with the the local natives, and they were just sort of subsumed into their population over time.
Wow. But
again,
back to the
survivors.
Not bringing farmers was maybe a
brewers, I think. Brewers and
maybe
farmers.
a bad call.
But so the English came first.
Yeah.
And then, so that means that the English ales then really started the American beer industry.
Yes.
Ooh, the English ales.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And beer was huge at Jamestown. Beer was a huge part of the early societies in New England. I mean, I think everybody knows the story of how when Plymouth, they didn't actually land first at Plymouth, by the way. They landed at Provincetown, which is on the northern tip of Cape Cod. And then they proceeded down the Cape to Plymouth. But when they landed there first, they ran out of beer. That was why they came ashore. And basically the ship's captains who brought these religious dissenters to the Americas said, okay, you got to get off. We don't have enough beer for the return trip home. And it's written in their journals that they had to get off.
So the Pilgrims were actually making a beer run.
Yes, they were. And we look at this differently because you have to realize that, today when I go into Quick Trip or I go into a store, there's 200 things I can drink. People, pre-industrialization, they had like 2 things that they could drink. And one of them was beer.
Well, especially on a ship.
Yeah.
You just didn't drink water.
No.
That wasn't an option. In fact, you look at a lot of like the British Navy, you kept meticulous records of everything. You had a allocation of ale or grog, which was like rum and water. You had every day, and that's what you had. And that was one of the not only biggest sources of calories, but water for people.
Right. No one said, well, I'd like a fruit juice. Could I have a smoothie, please? Could I have a sparkling water? I mean, that was just what you drank. So running out of beer, I mean, we kind of look at that and we make fun of that and think, oh, it's, here they are, 1619, they needed a beer run. Well, they actually, if you look at it, they needed a water run. So.
Well, the interesting thing is that I think our view of the Pilgrims, we view them as Puritans, right? Religious fundamentalists. And several centuries later, that was part of the movement that was behind the temperance movement and prohibition.
Right.
But at the time, that really wasn't a thing because beer was so fundamental that they couldn't have, that wasn't a luxury they could afford.
Right. And my students find it just, they're just shocked when I describe the fact that early people in the colonies, and this goes all the way up to when they were penning, the Declaration of Independence at Queen's Tavern in Philadelphia, people didn't drink water. Like they just can't wrap their head around this fact. And it's not because they don't think that there were like faucets or things like, I mean, when the people of European descent came to Roanoke and Jamestown and Plymouth and they settled the Great Lakes region, there was water everywhere. And it was fresh water and it was river water and it was good water, even if you would have just given it a quick boil. They just didn't drink it ever. They had gotten so accustomed to urban areas in Europe having polluted water that they never drank it.
So they get here, what kind of, you mentioned English ales. Was it the same? I mean, were they using the same recipe or were there ingredients that they were missing? Were they just getting by with what they had?
Well, and hops really don't become part of the equation on a wide scale until the early 19th century, because hop cultivation is different everywhere you go. I mean, if you've ever been to McFlushman's, we have some beautiful hop vines. Hop vines take a while to cultivate. It takes a while to perfect them.
Although they are like mint, if you do plant them in the ground, get ready. They will grow everywhere.
Right. And they explode, which is
good for beer.
Right. It's good for beer. But so they would use adjuncts like pine nuts, spruce tips. Have you ever brewed a beer with spruce tips?
Oh my God.
We did. I did once. And I just used some blue spruce cones from my backyard.
Yeah.
It wasn't horrible.
Now I'll go hiking with Bobby and our 5-year-old, and we're walking through the state park, and then he'll stop, and then he'll start like getting closer to a tree. And I just know he's thinking about what needles he can pull off that tree and put in. But no, Alex Schultz, our wonderful alderperson / handyman / Swiss Army knife of this place, wanted to do spruce tips, and he soaked them in a big, or I guess they're not spruce tips. They're like the pine cone.
Well, he and I did the extract thing.
Is that what it was?
Yeah, I bought a spruce extract, and we were desperate to flavor it with something, and we did it at beer school, and we used Ultima as the base.
Oh, right. No, I'm talking about a different story. Basically, there were these like really fresh little pine cones that hadn't wooded yet. I don't know what that term's called. But he basically saturated them and took a huge ass mallet and just started beating the crap out of them. But the problem was a huge 5-gallon bucket. And so he's like, oh, this won't take long. And like 4 hours later, the poor guy is just in the back still pounding these things.
Yeah, this sounds like an Alex story.
But it went into the beer. I think this was a Christmas beer that we did. I can't remember. But the spruce tip thing in the Ultima, I remember this because that was during when you were trying to simulate what it would have tasted like.
Yeah.
And
because when you take a beer history class or a beer science class at McFleshman's, we try to do things as authentically as possible.
And we also drink beer while we're doing it because it's just wrong to be in a beer school and not be drinking beer.
Correct.
So if they didn't have hops at first, what about malt?
Mm-hmm.
Because malting takes some effort too.
Yeah. Malting was occurring probably by the middle of the 1700s, but controlling the heat, they would basically build these elevated grain floors and heat from underneath the floor and walk on it with their boots as they're trying to, you got very inconsistent malting to begin with. You don't really get any consistency and any ability to control color until you get the rotary furnace malt. You don't get any consistency with that. So when they would brew a beer, and George Washington was frankly one of the most prolific brewers in the United States prior to 1900, he was constantly brewing. But he would brew these, what he called a small beer, and he wrote about it in his recipe. It's going to turn out different every time because they don't have any consistency in the malts and things like that. So that was undoubtedly something that was probably frustrating for early brewers, is, being able to kind of control the flow of the ingredients that come into even today in a modern brewery, they control everything from the gypsum in the water to the alpha acids in the hops.
Mm-hmm. This is one of the reasons that folks will ask us, like, why aren't you using the hops that are growing in the beer garden? We're like, oh, well, we actually don't have an accurate understanding of the alpha acid content in that particular hop.
Right. And to go about and develop that is probably just going to be more of a hassle than it's actually worth.
Well, and to the point about this, the variation in the color, it was a guy named Joseph Lavabond who came up with the beer color scale. And according to Wikipedia, thank you, fancy phone, he wasn't doing this until about 1900 or so. And so that sort of consistency or desire to be consistent didn't come around until late 1800s, 1900s or so. So we're still 200 years prior to that.
And one of the people who was most, I think I would use the word perturbed by this wild inconsistency in beer was someone who liked beer very much, but actually preferred Madeira wine because wine tended to be more consistent. But Thomas Jefferson was absolutely a beer guy, but he was troubled by the inconsistency of it. And he was such a tinkerer but like your husband, kind of a perfectionist and wanting everything to be perfect. And with the technology that they had at the time, they couldn't do that.
Where did beer stand in the hierarchy of beverages? Because when I think of the 18th century America, there's a lot of whiskey, a lot of rum, especially coming up from the Caribbean, and the rum was a huge part of the trade. And in New England, a lot of cider.
Yep.
Just because it was an easier thing to grow apples. So where was beer at this point kind of in American history in terms of popularity?
I think things like Madeira wine, which I mentioned with Jefferson, that had to be imported. That's going to get expensive. Rum is also imported. That's going to get expensive. There was actually, I think, one of the first temperance movements in U.S. history was kind of authored in part by Benjamin Rush, who was a famous early American physician / revolutionary. He warned against the consumption of spirits and actually encouraged the consumption of beer because beer, produced far different effects on the person who consumed that. And, and one of the things, and just to kind of take this into a slightly different direction, we would be remiss if we didn't point out that the founding fathers loved beer, and so much of the American Revolution, and excuse the pun, but the fermentation of that movement occurred at public houses and taverns and over pints in pewter glasses.
Well, that kind of makes sense. I mean, isn't it the same argument of some of the great writers is when the coffee and caffeine hit Europe, and that's when some of the great writers were able to all of a sudden just like, oh, I've got this crazy idea, because, you take your 2 espressos and all of a sudden you can conquer the world. I think it's the same thing. And as soon as you have a couple pints, you're like, oh, yeah, I'm going to do the thing I'm very scared to do now.
Well, and think about it this way. Beer's a social lubricant.
Right.
I mean, you put 4 or 5 people, you put John Adams and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and Samuel Adams in a room together without beer, there's probably going to be pretty prolific conversation. But when you add beer to the mix and they start to explore their grievances and they start to explore the different issues that they're having with taxation and mercantilism and all of the other things that went into the American Revolution, and now you add beer to it at a public house where other people are chiming in, like, this just makes perfect sense.
So if I may put this in another way, as Allison has often said, as yeast poops out alcohol, beer poops out liberty.
Oh my God.
Yes.
Yes.
Can we get a shirt with that?
Liberty is beer poop.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The Declaration of Independence was undoubtedly, written at the Queen's Tavern in part. When John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin were working on the document, they were undoubtedly, drinking beer. And in Jefferson's case, if he couldn't get the consistency of the porter that he liked, he was probably drinking Madeira because he was a little bit of a snob in that respect. But it's totally appropriate to say that the American Revolution was fermented by beer.
And do you know why Madeira was so popular as opposed to other wines?
I've been wanting to ask this question. What is Madeira wine? I don't even know.
Madeira, there's a small island off the coast of
It's not even off the coast.
West Africa.
Madeira.
It's Gibraltar area.
It's in the Atlantic. It's
Cool.
a Portuguese island. It's actually kind of close to the Azores.
You've been there, haven't you?
It's the one place I haven't been. I've been invited like 3 times.
This podcast has lost all
Oh, I
credibility.
know.
But it's the closest thing to the U.S. in terms of a wine producing region.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
It's simply proximity.
So it is cheaper.
Yeah.
I mean, in the long haul. Interesting.
And before the Columbian Exchange, that was the world's leading producer of sugar as well. So there was a relationship that Europeans had with that particular location.
And we should probably point out, this is the one thing many people might know, is that Samuel Adams was a brewer.
Yeah.
And that's why they named the brewery after him.
Yep.
Well, and as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, all of the founding fathers at some level had brewed. Ben Franklin was arguably the most scientifically curious person in American history. He was a father of the American Enlightenment. Jefferson was curious. They brewed. Washington was a prolific brewer. John Adams actually used more of his excess grain in distilling, but also had experience in brewing. So at some level, all of the founding fathers were being affected by some of the taxation changes that were coming through things like the Townshend Acts and other mercantilist policies of the British. And the net result of that is, particularly when you add it to beer and these public houses, was the American Revolution.
I am having this crazy realization that I was not interested at all in history when I was younger.
And you didn't have me as a teacher.
That's fair.
Yeah.
But I had good teachers. But when you don't have any experience in paying taxes or drinking beer and you're learning about all of these things, you're just like, I have no context for this. And now I'm just like, oh my God, the taxation. Don't get me started on taxations and beer right now. But that'll
be podcast number 25.
But no, I think we should require, U.S. citizens to go back and take some more history classes
Such as our history class that runs in the fall at McFleshman's.
Oh, there's a good idea.
How much of the beer and brewing scene around revolutionary America was urban versus what you would find out in the sticks? And I ask this because after the Revolution, one of the first big crises that the country faces is the Whiskey Rebellion.
Yep.
And whiskey was the thing that most of the farmers in the West, which at that time was Western Pennsylvania, were converting all their grain to. They weren't converting it into beer because it was more compact to put it into whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
Was this a phenomenon that in the public houses that were mainly seen in places like Boston, Philadelphia, New York?
Yes, I think beer probably was being produced in rural areas. However, I think it was far more common in urban areas. You were much more likely to have a public house with a cask pulled, and I'm going to let you go off on casks.
It's just superior.
A cask pulled ale. You were probably not going to find those. You were in a rural area. You're probably more likely to find distilled drinks.
So in kind of making a generalization, you see more of these larger urban areas, which actually weren't that large at the time, in the north.
Yes.
In the south, Virginia on down, there really aren't any. Maybe Charleston is the biggest one. Do you think that was, they had a part to play? There were serious differences, obviously, between the north and the south.
Mm-hmm.
Slavery being the biggest one, but also in their approaches, I think, to how they wanted to see the country form.
Yep. Their attitudes in beer were divergent, too. Beer was far more common in the north,
I'm also
particularly in port cities.
Wondering, and I have no knowledge of this, but a question, the average daily temperature, though. So the fermentation, in order to get the yeast to actually ferment to where it's a potable drink, you need to have it slightly cooler temperatures. And so
you would.
Is it even possible to have that in the South?
No. And I'll use Mount Vernon as an example. Washington would store his beer in a beer cellar and was very particular about usually drinking it within a week because it would have soured and had gone foul to such a degree that they needed to, get it out there as quickly as possible. And I think we should also point out that given the nature of wild yeast versus what we brew with, here and in home brewing situations, the beer was undoubtedly very sour and usually contaminated.
Yeah. But then the distillation process is going to be just technically easier to do in the South.
Yes.
Go to.
What was the alcohol content of the beer they were drinking? Was this high alcohol or rather low alcohol?
2.78%.
No, usually.
That's very low.
I have no idea.
Oh.
and like Washington, I keep coming back to him because he was so prolific in writing in his journals. Like he had a recipe for a small beer and a strong beer. Now, and I think they brewed these things at Colonial Williamsburg, and I think the strong beer probably came out at about 6.5. The small beer that they were brewing, super fast turnaround. They would go through a boiling process. They would then kind of allow the beer to come down to a normal temperature. And then there wasn't any refrigeration, which is they're using almost all ale yeast, obviously. They're using all ale yeast, which is then doing its best to probably ferment something that hadn't been cooled properly. Mm-hmm. Plus, it's probably 75 degrees So you're ending up with something that's really not very refined. And the yeast, and you can talk about the chemistry of this, but the yeast is going to eat the beer, it's going to poop out the alcohol, et cetera, and it's going to affect the ABVs. You want to take that over, chemist?
No. No, I just quick Google search. The English small beer is less than 2.8%. So I was damn close.
Yeah.
Go team.
It's not big.
Yeah.
But with regards to ABV and chemistry, it's really difficult to drive up ABVs with inconsistent yeast and inconsistent temperature.
If the yeast aren't healthy enough and if they don't have the right sugars, but then again, depending on depending on the temperatures, depending on a lot of other external factors, the chemical pathways, you can almost think of it like kind of like a chutes and ladders game. So where you have to set everything right to get to the one piece to land on the ladder that goes all the way to the top. And unless everything falls into place, you're probably going to end on the ladder that goes only up 2 or 3 or whatever. I play chutes and ladders a lot. I have a 5-year-old.
Yeah, I played chutes and ladders with your 5-year-old many times, and she always ends up on that ladder that goes from like
right. So she is like a perfectly
96.
propagated yeast that is very healthy.
Yes.
But anyway, so what happens is at the higher temperatures, there's a lot of different chemical pathways that open up that wouldn't be open for the chemicals to go through that process at the lower temperature.
So if you were to go back in time, you're teleported back to revolutionary America, you go into a pub. Do you think you would actually like that beer?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, you know me really well. What do you think?
No, because there are no hops.
Right.
I think I probably...
You would be okay.
I would be okay. I probably would... The acrid notes and some of the souring and such would probably not as blend as well with the malt, and probably the mouthfeel would be weird. But I like cask conditioned ales, which are going to be a lower carbonation. There's a subtle sweetness that's complemented by the hops, and the malts are complemented by the hops that just kind of cut the sweetness, but the hops aren't forward at all. And so these beers would not have had any hop character whatsoever. So I think I probably would have liked it. Although I'd also be a woman and probably not, allowed to drink. And then I would be really pissed. And then I would take down the patriarchy because you know what? F the patriarchy. Oh, did I digress? I'm sorry.
That was, yes.
All right. Well, that's going to conclude this episode. We'll leave that on a high note. Please remember to join our Facebook group and support us over on Patreon, links to both of which are in the show notes. And until next time, please remember to respect the beer.